mute it. And speaks, you can mute it. And let it. Okay, Jan, you are right now. You can start the session.
Thank you, Arco. Do you see my screen actually?
I'm sorry?
Do you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So let me see if I can switch. Yes, you see the screen. Well, I hope everything is doing well in Tarbes, and I would like to welcome you all to this session on fair domain ontologies for industry. I would like to start with an apology. I was planning to come to Tarbes actually to do that physically in the room with you, but unfortunately, due to personal reason, I have to be in Montpellier tonight, so I had to cancel my trip. But I'm pretty sure that we'll have a great session together this morning. So my name is Yann Lefranc. I am actually a partner in the Ontologies project, and today the idea was to present you some of the work that we did in Ontologies and how we used also and leveraged some work done in other projects. So as you may have seen in the agenda, I am going to talk a lot today. And I will start now with a short intro to give you the context and start discussing with you how to make ontology fair. Of course, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. And if you don't hear me properly, the same. And let me now switch to my presentation. So I would like to start with a quick presentation of myself. So basically, I'm a CEO and scientific director of a company called the Science Data Factory based in France. I've been working in semantic web and mixed data and ontologies for more than 10 years now, coming up from the neuroscience field up to now industry. And I'm also working a lot on FAIR principles and their implementation since they have been proposed. Throughout the company, we are involved in multiple new projects around FAIR and Ontology, including Commons. And I actually lead and co-lead and contribute to several international working groups in these domains. So, for instance, there is the Research Data Alliance, Vocabulary and Semantic Service Interest Group that you will hear about. There's the FAIR Digital Object, Semantic Working Group. I'm also part of the year's Semantic Interoperability Task Force and the group FAIR Inter, among the most important ones. So now let's go back to the program of this workshop. I will start with a short intro and context, going from the landscape analysis we did in Ontologies to fair compliance of ontologies. Then I will briefly talk about what does it mean for an ontology to be fair, give you some overview of the work that has been done in another project called FAIR. And then I will leave the floor to my colleague Arco Paul, who will talk about publishing ontologies in specialized ontology repositories. Then I will briefly mention some of the work we did using some of the existing recommendations to start evaluating the fairness of ontologies. And then this short presentation is going to be followed by a presentation of the tooling that exists to do that. One talk on FOOPS, which is a product developed by Daniel Garrijo and Maria Poveda, and Maria is going to present that today. And OFER and Ontoportal that will be presented by Clément Jonquet. And I will conclude with some presentation of the work we have been doing with Clément in the context of the FAIR project toward the harmonization of ontology metadata. So I don't know how many of you, and actually I don't see you, so it's hard for me to know, but sorry, something on my computer. So one of the things I would like to start is you've been hearing about FAIR, right? And the idea is, what are the FAIR principles? In 2016, there's been a paper that's been written down in Scientific Data in Nature by a bunch of colleagues that actually started to propose guiding
Sorry,
principles.
Jan, we cannot see any presentation or screen share from you if you are sharing.
I'm sorry, that for some reason it stopped sharing. Okay, just give me a sec, I'm fixing that. So, full screen. I need to do that. Yes, there we go. Do you see my screen again?
Yes.
Great.
Uh,
So, yeah, so basically the FAIR principles. The idea is to actually start a set of guiding principles so that we can make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And at the time of the publication, that paper actually gained a lot of attention, and actually it's been endorsed by a lot of very large organizations around the world. And you can see, of course, you can go to download the paper and read it if you haven't. I would encourage you to do so. You can also go on the GoFair website, which is the international organization which is promoting the FAIR principles, where all these principles are explained in detail. But in practice, what are the FAIR principles? Well, basically, these are a set of principles to turn data from machine first. The reason why is that we are generating tons of data, right? And it is impossible for human beings to actually go manually through all the data. So we need at some point to have a way to automate a lot of the process. And for that, we need to transform data into machine actionable unit of information so that we can build tools that will help us leverage these data. So there are 15 principles that are distributed around the 5 topics: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. Some of the interesting things is that within these principles, there's two things that are very important. One is metadata, where it is required that data are described with rich metadata. And for boosting interoperability, this metadata and the data should also use vocabularies and ontologies, of course, that follows the FAIR principles. So in a sense, ontology are first-class citizens of the FAIR principles. Why does it matter? Well, in OntoCommons, we aim at using ontologies to do data documentation for industries, right? So, well, it's kind of a thing, ontologies. And so basically, it's good for us because it means that by working with on this, we do help also industry to become compliant with the FAIR principles, or at least part of them. Within the project, together with Arco, Maria, and many others involved in the task 3.2, we were wondering, now we are working on ontologies, but what are the ontologies that exist for industry? And actually, what are the domain ontologies, right, that would be relevant for industry? What would be their characteristics? Meaning format, serialization, do they use higher logic? Are they aligned to top-level ontologies? So basically, what we started to do is a landscape analysis of domain ontologies for industry. Now, how did we collect our sample? Well, we started to gather knowledge from the project, because we do work actually with a lot of experts in ontologies for industry. So we collected a lot of information there. We organized also workshops with experts. There was also the Doric and M workshop, which was actually quite good, that allowed us to collect a lot of information on ontologies on different domains. And we use what we call the long survey, which is showed here on the right side of the slide. And you have the link there, which is basically a survey that helps us collecting any information on any ontology that would be relevant for industry. And what we did in the context of OntoCommons is that, well, we want to share, right? Because this is going to be a valuable resource for all the stakeholders. And so basically, this survey is actually then transformed into a catalog, an ontology catalog for OntoCommons, And I provided the link here, and you can actually look at the deliverable that explains how it works. Now, what about our data set? So what we managed to do is to collect almost 300 entries. So we had a huge amount of content that we needed to clean up, to remove duplicates, to remove also things that were partial, with no or little information. And we ended up with a data set, a clean data set, and that of 130 ontologies that we classified in 5 domains that are related to industry: physics and chemistry, mechanical and industrial engineering, thermal and process engineering, material science and engineering, computer science, systems, and electrical engineering. And if you are interested in this work, I would invite you to read our deliverable that you can actually access either on the website, from the website of Ontologies or on Zenodo, following up the link that is provided on the slide. Once we consolidated this data set, what we started to do is to ask questions, right? And start looking at different aspects. And I'm not going to detail everything because we did actually quite an extensive analysis of various aspects, but I'm just going to showcase today just a few of them, because that's not the main point, and we could spend an hour just discussing about the work we did. But what we started to look at is at the distribution of the number of ontologies we managed to collect per domain, to look at, well, which domains were actually more in advance in terms of ontologies than others. We found out actually, looking at the diagram on the center, that thermal and computer system, thermal and process engineering, and computer systems, computer science systems, and electrical engineering are the least, well, are the ones that have the least numbers of ontologies. That does not mean that they do not have ontologies. It just means also that maybe we are not aware of the rest. So this landscape analysis, in a sense, is always ongoing work. It's not finished. One thing that we looked at as well is the format in which we can find these ontologies, and we realized that actually a lot of the ontologies are actually in a format that is not machine readable. Basically, these ontologies are published in papers, which prevents us to actually use them in any use case. Before to do so, we will need to actually implement a machine-readable representation of that ontology. And we looked at what was the most common way ontologies were published in the different domains. And it turns out that among all the things we found on the thermal and process engineering, all of them were just papers. None of them were actually ontologies we could use in practice. We also looked at things like the type of serialization that was used for the machine-readable ontologies. So the most common is RDF-XML format. The other one is Turtle. Sometimes we manage to actually find ontologies that are shared with multiple serialization. And one of the things that we also looked at is whether or not ontologies have some degrees of overlap. And for that, we use some tools that Arco is going to present later on, related to the ontology portal. But basically what we did is started to do a sort of alignment matrix or overlap matrix that allow us to understand which ontologies are actually related in terms of content. But one of the things that actually interested us as well is the problem of fair compliance, right? We saw before that ontologies must be fair. So what about our data sets? Are these ontologies, or at least the machine-readable ones, fair? So we started to look at what does it mean for an ontology to be fair. And I've been working on that for the past 3-4 years now, within the context of Paris Fair, which was a European project that ended in February this year. And the idea there was to actually try to build up a set of recommendations to tell people what they should consider or what they should do to make their ontology fair. This work was done in iterative way, so we had three iterations over the course of the project. And that led to actually a set of 17 generic recommendations that are all aligned with a particular FAIR principles that I presented you earlier, and 12 best practices, which are more things that you can do to improve findability, but it doesn't fit with one of the particular FAIR principles. Over the course of the project, we actually interacted with a lot of the communities that are involved in semantics, different domains from science and so on. And we worked with the experts to actually align these recommendations with the RFC 2119 recommendation, which is actually whether these should be mandatory, recommended, or optional. And we ended up, after a vote, by having 9 mandatory recommendations, 7 recommended recommendations, and 1 optional, and 1 we were not able to actually say anything because it's a global community-wide recommendation. All these recommendations are public, so you can go on Zenodo, find the deliverables. You can also go on GitHub, and I put the link here. All these recommendations are as issues, and you can comment at will if you have some disagreement or if you would like to contribute. Although the project is finished, this is still ongoing work, and there are some of the discussions that are still happening. So how we did build them, we organized tons of workshops over the course of 3 years, trying to engage as many scientific communities and expert communities as possible over the course of the 3 years. Engage with them. We also had an intense collaboration with the Research Data Alliance, which is an international organization about data management, where you can find and discuss with experts from all around the world on common thematic. And in particular, we worked with the Vocabulary and Semantic Service Interest Group because it's related to ontologies, where we created 2 discussion groups or task groups, one on minimum metadata that was led by Clément Jonquet, who's going to talk later on, and Luis Bonino to define a minimum metadata schema for semantic artifacts, meaning ontologies. Oh, sorry, I see a typo here. And also define a detailed profile to publish collections of these ontologies. And another discussion group on the impact of the recommendation on semantic repositories, meaning ontology repositories, led by Alexandra Kokinaki, my colleague from the NERC Vocabulary Service in UK, and Jerry Kuhn, who used to contribute with us in the Ferris Fair. And the idea there was to actually see if the ontology repository or the ontology services publishes the ontology actually fits with the recommendation, and if not, with what is missing, and also to establish a list of possible technical implementation that actually fulfill these recommendations. We did not reinvent the wheel because that was not the objective. All we did was always trying to have a look as well at things that were proposed outside of our project. For instance, we actually tried to align with the work of Maria and Danielle that was published in 2020. In 2020, there was also some work on vocabulary, must-disclose vocabularies by Simon Cox and collaborators in 2021. And we also looked deeply into the community recommendation on how to handle ontologies, like the Obo-Foundry principles, which is related to the biomedical domain, and also the industry ontology foundry principles. So we didn't want to have recommendations that are completely disconnected from what exists. So although the alignment may not be perfect, at least we try to keep up and to look at what was also existing and to make sure it's internal. So here are some of the recommendations. I classified them by topic. So in FAIR and the FAIR principles, one of the key things is to make sure that data and metadata have a proper identifier, which means that that identifier should be globally unique, persistent, resolvable as well. And so we have 2 recommendations on that. One that says that ontologies and their contents, meaning terms, concepts, classes, and relations, depending on the structure, as well as their version, must have a globally unique, persistent, and resolvable identifier. The same goes for metadata, which goes a little bit against the common practice now in the ontology world, where the metadata is in the file, basically. So we used to not have a metadata record that is separated, and that has some drawbacks that actually does not help with the fair implementation. We also have a bunch of requirements on the metadata and the documentation of these ontologies. Also things on what we call semantic alignment, whether or not we should use top-level ontologies for aligning semantic artifacts. Here, it's an optional one, and one of the reasons is throughout the discussion, semantic artifact is a broad concept that encompasses thesaurus, controlled vocabularies, formal ontologies. And so basically, that works only for formal ontologies. They're not necessarily aligned because vocabularies are for national ontologies. But this is something that needs to be considered, and that's something we are working on as well in Ontology. So it's in line with the recommendation. And also things about mappings. Ontologies are separate entities, but they have, as we saw, some overlap. And sometimes we use different name for the concept, but it talks about the same thing. So these mappings or these relations between the ontologies should also be fair. And this is one of the recommendations. And we also have a bunch of recommendations on repositories. Most of the time we find ontologies in GitHub, which means that if you want to work with it, you need to download the file, parse the file in order to work with it. And what we actually promoted within the FAIR project and the FAIR semantics recommendation is that these ontologies should be published also on specialized ontology repositories that should provide access basically to the ontology, the metadata, and the content of the ontology through API codes so that you can start building science that do not have to struggle with the parsing of the different files of the ontology, but just work with the content. And that makes a perfect transition to the next talk, which is going to be given by Arco, who is going to present the work we did in Onto Commons on publishing ontologies in specialized ontology repository. So I will stop sharing my screen so that Arco can actually share his. I think I stopped sharing my screen. And if you have questions, well, at the time Arco actually switched presentation, please shoot.
Hi, Ian. I need to just put my USB.
But if you have questions, you can always use the Q&A session and the chat.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, full screen, perfect. Arco, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yes. Okay, I'm starting now. Hello, I'm Arco Paul Sarkar, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher here. I'm going to present our new initiative, I will say, which is called Industry Portal. And though the context of the Industry Portal is much broader, but I will present the fairness part of this tool. and the rest of the industry portal, there is a session on the fourth day, which is called Onto Commons Ecosystem, which where we will try to show many other features of industry portal. And the entire work was heavily done by M. Namdudi. She is not here. I do not know if she is online. However, she is also to be considered as a co-author or co-presenter of this session. So I will start with a snippet of the interview, which was done by Onto Commons just 1 month back, and it is available on the website. So Professor Brady Smith, who some of you may know, he thinks that for Onto Commons project, the one of the most important part is that if it can offer public resource where all the major ontologies, their uses, and their users are listed. And then he's saying that, okay, of course, it needs to focus on the top level ontology more. However, the context of this talk was especially for the industry, including material science, but we found it, of course, very much aligned to our thought that, okay, as you have heard in the morning in the keynote, that there is a lack of compilation and integration of the ontologies in the industrial domain. And so we took this opportunity and tried to create a repository which is the first time, I mean, there is no repository which is dedicated to the industry specifically. And we call that industry portal. So of course, we want to make this repository to have the industrial community to store their ontology, maintain them, and the users, and then provide users one-stop shop for the ontologies. Now, what is in our scope? Of course, as all the industrial ontology, but especially we want to devote it to the outcomes of the Onto Commons, which will be mapping of the existing ontologies. So, of course, there is an opportunity to also compile a lot of ontologies, and Ian will present our state of the art, where we actually collected, I mean, many ontologies, and then of course there will be some new ontologies which will be developed as part of the project. So we want to store them. However, it is open to the all industrial community, and everybody is free to store their ontology, which is regarding, I mean, on any topic regarding industry. So this repository is built using Onto Portal platform, Onto Portal and technology, formerly known as NCBO. And it is hosted here in this institute in France. And the URL is here. It's called industryportal.space, and you can find the QR code. Right now, there are almost 32 ontologies. I mean, and also this is supported by Onto Commons project, and we have collaboration with LIM, Montpellier, and then Clément Jonque is here from that institute. In the next slide, it will be more clear that how this collaboration actually helped us in putting FAIR directly in this tool. So now jumping into the FAIR, so we thought that, okay, we have this industrial ontology, and as you all know, being part of this session, FAIR is an extremely important concern for ontologies to be findable, reusable, accessible, and integrable. we wanted to make sure that we provide a kind of fairness evaluation of the ontologies which are stored in this repository, and we chose a fairness evaluation tool called OFAIR, and it has been proposed and developed by Emnam Duni and Clément Jonque, and you can see their publication below. What it is that it takes the FAIR principles what Ian was talking about, and then creates some of these questionnaires which can act as a testing, as some test on the ontology metadata to see that whether those FAIR principles has been followed or not, and then assign a kind of score based on that. So for sure, I'm not going into the detail because Clément will present this particular evaluation strategy in detail. But I will rather show that how it will look how it looks in the industry portal. So this is an overall fairness state of the ontologies in the portal, and it will give some. It actually give you the score on these 4 axes. Then you also can find the fairness score for the individual ontologies, which you can find on the right after you click on a particular ontology, and also see the detail of those metadata associated with that ontology, which actually analyzed by the OFAIR tool to derive this score. Now, of course, not going too much into the detail as Clément will talk more, but this fairness tool actually is developed based on MOD 1.4 reference model. So there are 57 core metadata, which will give you, which the ontology developer should provide the metadata value for. But of course, there are 70 extra metadata. If the developer can or the ontology owner can provide the metadata value for, then the ontology becomes even fairer. When we say fairer, that means that, okay, there are, so the score is kind of divided like this. So there are some core questions which you need to answer for the metadata, which will make your ontology fair. But then at the same time, if you can answer the extra question, it will make it fairer even. And then you can find the publication regarding it published by Amduni and Jonque, which will talk about the questionnaire and the scoring scheme, how this is derived. So there are 61 FAIR questions in OFAIR. And then when you go to the industry portal and then you try to submit an ontology, you can see all the questions which you can provide the value for. And it looks something like this. So of course, it is almost impossible to capture the entire list of questionnaires, but this is a snapshot of it. And a little bit walkthrough on what is this FAIR score is about. Of course, there is 2 types of score. One is the global FAIR score, which can go something like 300, 400, or even lower. But then there is a normalized score, which will give you a kind of idea that where your ontology stands. So the total FAIR score and the global normalized score are the 2 types of scoring it will provide. Of course, you can also find all the explanation which can be which you can analyze to see that how you can improve your ontology, which answer you did not provide, and it will give you a clear guide on each of these tests that what is present and what is not. And of course, you can also get the FAIR metadata back into a JSON, and then we have the web services for which using which you can get those JSON LD or RTF XML or any type of format which you can use in several different third-party tools. So now, concluding it, we in the industry portal we use this tool called OFAIR, which is a generic specific. Which consider an aligned set of metadata, measurement, and integrate many different metadata standards available under this emoji. And then Clemo will talk more about it. And then, of course, as I said, it provides these 3 levels of, evaluation: not fair, fair, and then fairer. And of course, it enabled this automatic evaluation. So as we integrated it, as soon as you post an ontology, the fairness evaluation will kick in and give you the score of that. However, we want to go beyond that. So what we need to do in industry portal, because it is heavily invested in ontology, its content, so the fairness evaluation also need to go to the content of the ontology, not the ontology artifact itself. So maybe we have to also include the metadata annotation on the class and then properties and other axiom if present. And then, of course, there are other type of matrices which are very popular for ontology and has been proposed in the literature. For example, accuracy, adaptability, clarity, completeness, stability, fitness. And then there are, of course, some of these third-party services which will give you this evaluation of this matrices. For example, Ontometric and then OQuare, which we need to integrate to industry portal to provide the scoring against these metrics. So that is all from my side. If there is any question, I can answer, but I will be in this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Is there any question for Arco? Well, if not, I just mentioned that what Arco said in the introduction is a key, right? So there was something missing in the industry landscape of services. And these ontology portals have been extremely successful in scientific domains like the biomedical domain, because Ontoportal used to be Bioportal in the first place, where you can find more than 800 ontologies, right? There's something like 5 to 8 million concepts that are listed there that are available, of course, through a user interface, but also through API calls, which makes it actually an essential tool if you start thinking about working with ontologies in the context of industry. Now, I will continue talking. Today it's a me show, right? So I'm sorry, I'm going to give a lot of presentation. But this is related to the fairness assessment that Arco mentioned. At the time, let me just share my screen. Yeah, here. Do that, share screen, sorry. Here it is. At the time where we started working on the landscape analysis I actually mentioned in the introduction, well, OFAIR was there, but at the time it was stuck with AgroPortal, which is an ontology portal for agronomy and agriculture ontologies. So we could not use it directly for all the ontologies we found out. FOOPS was not around when we delivered the first version of this landscape analysis. And so we started to actually look at how we could evaluate the compliance with the FAIR principles for the ontology we found out in the landscape analysis. And so I'm going to talk briefly about that manual evaluation matrix or methods that we set up in the context of the landscape analysis to at least get a glance of the situation before we could use better tools or more refined tools. So the idea is that we started with what exists, and what exists was at the point the semantics recommendation that I presented in the introduction. And so basically what we did is we took this list of recommendations. In red here, you will see the mandatory one, in yellow, the recommended, and in the green is the optional. And we started looking at what's the target, meaning does it apply to the ontology, the repository, or something else? And so we started classifying them. And once classified, we ended up with a bunch of recommendations that are purely focused on the ontologies. With these recommendations, what we started to do is to say, okay, we need to evaluate whether or not the ontology is compliant with this recommendation. So we started laying out a set of questions. So actually there's 13 questions that need to be extremely simple to answer. It must be a yes or no, right? And it turns out that for some recommendations, there are more than one question that you need to answer in order to get a score. For the methodology and the scoring, the idea was to try to find somewhat a way to give you at the end of the exercise, once you went through all these questions, to evaluate how far you are from fair. And so we started with a very conservative method. Basically, if a recommendation is fulfilled, you score 1. If it's not, then you score 0, which is very basic. Now, where it's very conservative is that if a recommendation is represented by several questions, you need to answer all these questions positively to score 1, otherwise you score 0, right? And from that, we started very, very basic score. So it's not representative, it's definitively a first shot, basically. And we determined 2 scores that to us was important. One is what we call the FAIR score, which is basically the percentage of mandatory recommendations that are fulfilled. And a more relaxed score, more global, the global FAIR score, where basically we look at the percentage of all the fulfilled recommendations, which includes the mandatory, but of course the recommended and optional. How we did the measurements? Well, you have 13 questions, then you fire up your friend, Excel, which is the most convenient way of starting things. Sorry. And we started to look into our own data set and started to evaluate whether or not the ontologies answer, and we calculate the score automatically. So it is published, but not presented this way. In the deliverable, we did an assessment of 44 ontologies out of the 74 machine-readable ontologies available at the time of the first version. And we calculate the average fairness score by domain that we use for classifying. And here are 4 domains: physics and chemistry, mechanical and industrial engineering, material science and engineering, computer science system, and electrical engineering. And what we found out is that basically physics and chemistry is the domain with the highest fair score. It's not bad. 34, let's say 35% of the mandatory recommendations are fulfilled. Not bad. For the global FAIR score, it gets better because some of the recommended were actually fulfilled. So you go up to 43% of the total fairness. The lowest in terms of FAIR score and in terms of global FAIR score was mechanical and industrial engineering. One thing that was interesting, we had one ontology in the data set we analyzed, the allotrope ontology, which is the most fair ontology. It's not 100%, but almost. And the most important thing is that based on that evaluation scheme, no ontologies that we analyzed actually passed the threshold of minimally fair, meaning the 100% of the mandatory. So as a conclusion, this was a great tool to get started for assessing the fairness of ontologies. And actually, it was quite fun because end of August, Clément Jonquet organized the Hackathon here in Montpellier. And actually, we tested our tool. And it turns out that we did a small contest using the different fair evaluation tools. And the three winners, among the three winners, two of them started with this small set of questions to actually look at what they need to change to improve fairness. And actually, the three top scorer, which is great. Second thing is the feedback they gave us is that, well, it's rather simple to get started because clearly you see what is missing and you can act upon it. And within a day, you can start improving your fairness assessment very quickly. And then you can pass it through the fair evaluators, the automated ones like OFAIR or FOOT, to check whether or not you did better scoring. Keep in mind, though, is that we actually filtered out all the recommendations that are not concerning ontologies, which means that in a sense, in our evaluation tool, but all the FAIR principles are covered. And this is something that we need to take into account. Also, these questions are based on high-level recommendations, so there's no real practical implementation that is defined. So there are many different ways that you can actually address this issue. So that makes sometimes the answer to these questions tricky. And one of the points also that I would like to make on that particular method is that, well, there's no consideration about the content of metadata for describing ontology, right? One of the things we started to do in the version 2 of the work on the landscape analysis, which is now published on Zenodo, right, is that we actually worked with FOOPS, who actually was delivered recently after we released version 1, and we did a comparison, but I don't want to talk much about it. I would like to give the floor to Maria so that she can now talk about FOOPS. Maria, the floor is yours. Stop sharing.
Hello, I'm sharing my screen.
Sure. In the meanwhile, is there any questions? Well, if not, let's move forward and we'll have some at the end of the presentation to chit chat.
Okay, so I'm Maria Poveda Villalón, and I'm an associate professor at the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, and I am also a partner we are also a partner in OntoCommons project. And I'm going to present a little bit about FOOPS because we are a little bit late on the schedule, and I think I can skip some slides as Jan and Arco already commented on many basic initiatives. And I would like to thank Daniel Garijo for the slides that actually he was presenting last week 2 weeks ago in the Agro Hackathon. So we are joining also these efforts, and I'm going to continue. And well, this work is mainly done by Daniel Garijo and me, and also supervised or directed with Oscar Corcho. This is the slides I think I can skip because Jan have already mentioned the FAIR initiative and the research that Alliance and other initiatives that are working around the FAIR principles. What I'm more interested in is to mention that, the FAIR initiative started in around 2016 or a little bit before, but we, by the semantic web community, is, let's say, a community driven by openness, because almost all what we do is based on openness. Actually, based on the 5-star ranking defined by Tim Berners-Lee, and the first star is to have everything open with an open license and available on the web, and then machine readable in an open format. So, by default, we build data and ontologies following some openness principles. Then there is a clear match with the FAIR principles that came afterwards. And these linked data principles and 5-star rating were mostly oriented to the to the data, but very soon there were some adaptation of these principles and 5-star rankings adapted to ontologies. You see here the references 2 and 3. That is a blog post from Bernard Batant, who was one of the creators of Link Open Vocabularies in Mondeca, a company in Paris. And Christoph Janovic y Pascal and colleagues that define also 5-star ranking for vocabularies. And then Daniel Garijo, so the W3C, the best practices for publishing, semantic web best practices working group, published best practices for accessing vocabularies and publishing vocabularies, and that was very technical about the content negotiations. And there are tutorials also, in this case this is Daniel Garijo, about how to properly publish vocabularies. So we were already in this community working about how to make our ontologies more accessible and understandable by others. Then in 2020, we were doing this exercise about how the semantic web or the ontologies-oriented works about openness match the FAIR principles. So in this table, you have in the columns the FAIR principles, and in the rows, the first FAIR recommendations that Jan already talked about them. The best practices for implementing FAIR vocabularies, that is the book, the chapter written by Daniela and me, and then the 5-star ranking from Bernard and from Christophe and Pascal. And then we were analyzing how these best practices that we have match the FAIR principles. And here in the reference 7, I included the link to the publication in case you want to see what was the analysis about. It was about what are we doing in the semantic web that we should keep. And also there was some discussion about things that do not match, but we don't have much time today for going into the details. Then once we have analyzed the different recommendations from first FAIR, mostly the FAIR principles and how we publish ontologies in the semantic web, we said, okay, we can make a validation service oriented to or based in OOPS. So OOPS here is a ontology pitfall scanner that is a simple or very easy to use website where you just upload your ontology and it looks for things that looks wrong. So, and it become very useful for many people and easy to use. And we said, okay, let's follow the same approach and do the same, but for the FAIR principles, just checking things that are related to FAIR principles. Then we define the same idea. We include a URI. Here you have the link to the service that I'm going to show later. And here, and then you include just the URI of your ontology that should be published, or if it is not a URI that redirects to your ontology code, you can always include the URL that points to the exact file that you have in your GitHub repository if you are working on it. Then you just click validate and get the results. And in these results, we saw the title of the ontology that should be declared within the ontology metadata, the URI that the user have inserted, and the license if it is included in the ontology metadata. And we don't want to list all the metadata fields that we find because the user knows that. And then the validation is divided into the 4 categories of the FAIR principles: findable, accessible. You can see my pointer? Yes. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And here we have a summary for each category so that the user can say, okay, so my ontology is quite findable, but maybe I should improve the interoperable dimension. And it gives you the exact number of how many tests you passed out of how many tests are defined. And also another summary or another view of the same information that we have here, but in a more general level, is this percentage, the overall score, like how fair it is, and we should consider it how fair, considering only the tests that we were able to automate. So there is a note here that it could be taken as a quality indicator. It was not really our aim to use that as a threshold or a mean to compare ontology's fairness, but if you wish, it could be used as an indicator. Then, in the main part of the response that you get from the website, there are the results for each category. Okay, you can collapse or expand each category, and within each category, we have different tests. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable are the categories, the big categories. And for each of them, for example, here we have expanded the interoperable, we have a different test. So the tests are related to the FAIR principle. So for example, this first test is related to the interoperable principle 1. That is metadata use formal, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. And each test can have one or more checks. So we can make more than one compromission for each test. In the first one, you see that there is only one, that is that the RDF code is available. And then we get here to which extent it is fulfilled. In many cases, it is 0 or 100 because it is binary, but not all the tests are binary. And another example is the second test, that is related to the FAIR principle E2, metadata use vocabularies that follow FAIR principles. And in this case, we have more than one check. And for those that we can provide an explanation, we have, well, all of them have the description. And in some cases, we can tell you, okay, you have the title and the author, but you don't have the license or the creation date. And then you will get an explanation of the response of the check. And this is the list or the summary of the supported tests that we have now. So for findable, we check that the URI is resolvable and that it is persistent, and the IRI version exists in the metadata and resolves when you look it up. Also, there is Ontology ID, and it is a URI and some minimum metadata. If you want to see this, what we consider the minimum metadata, and we are based on the best practices published here. Okay, is the reference 6, but also in the website you have all the references. Oops. We also check, for example, that the prefix is registered in prefix CC, or that the ontology is registered in a registry. But of course, we have a list of registries, but if a new registry is available, let us know, because we will need to update the implementation of the test. Also, as you can see, there is some checks that can be used for many principles. For example, that the ontology is in a registry is an aspect that you can check in findable, but it is also an aspect that you can check in accessible. Well, the slides are going back and forwards all the time. Okay, I don't want to give you so much time, so I will go for the to summarize the rest. About the interoperable, so we check that the ontology is in RDF, in one or more serializations, and that we can process that. Also here, you see that the ontology reuses well-known vocabularies for declaring metadata. Again, this point is related to the minimum metadata because we are checking the labels from these vocabularies, Dublin core, schema, provenance, but again, more vocabularies that also define ontology metadata could be added to the check. And also we look at the URIs of the concepts and the properties that are in the ontology, so that we can check whether other ontologies or vocabularies are reused. Okay. And finally, for reusable, so we check that there is an HTML representation of the ontology. That is that when I look at the URI, I get either the code or the human-oriented documentation. This extensive metadata is provided with ontology. This is like at the second level of the minimum metadata that we check in the findable. And as I mentioned, the distinction is in the publication number 6. And we also check that there are labels and descriptions for all the terms and properties that are defined in the ontology. And this point is interesting about the license because there are two levels. Like once the ontology have a license, or the license of the ontology is also provided as a URI, and then it is resolvable, and then I can process it in RDF. And also whether there is provenance information. And if, as I mentioned, there are many other vocabularies, metadata vocabularies, or other checks that we didn't think of when mapping the FAIR principles and the recommendations to the means of programmatically or automatically check the principles, because of course there are always things to check by humans. So if you find any error or new suggestions or come up with new tests, you can let us know. And then I include here the GitHub repository for FOOPs, where you can use the code or open issues or comment and also send us an email. And I like to also to include in this link for the publications, because you see there all the publications and reports in which the FOOPs checks are based on. And I think this is all from my side. I hope I didn't took too much time, Jan.
No, perfect, Maria. Thank you very much. Just a thing, I do agree with you that FAIR is not new. It's been presented as such, but it's been, in fact, sort of crystallization of ideas coming up from POS 11, linked open vocabulary, and so on, that actually tries to federate everything. There's one thing that needs to be, though, clarified, that in the case of ontology, I totally agree with Maria. Things should be open, so that makes things easier for others to reuse, because reinventing semantic models is not necessarily a good practice, but reusing them is better. That avoids having different technical problems in the end. But fair doesn't mean open. That's one thing that needs to be really put forward, which is why fair is also something that needs to be considered by industry carefully. Because as I mentioned, the idea is to actually make data as an actionable information unit that you can use and build clients and systems around them. Now, I would like to stop, and I would like to invite Clément to actually present OFAIR. Thank you again, Maria, for this kind presentation, nice presentation. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about the fact that we need to converge among the different tools. But first, Clément.
Hello everyone. So can you guys confirm you can hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear, and
you can see the slide.
we see the slide.
Okay, so that's good to me. Thanks, Jan, for double checking. And I'm copy pasting
Well,
just to
maybe your voice is a bit low, so if you can talk next
so
to
I'll
the mic,
talk in front of the computer. It should be better like that, I think.
it's a bit better, yeah.
Okay, so I'm starting with OFAIR that have been mentioned a few times. That's my first time, the first time in my life I'm presenting in two workshops in parallel this morning. So it started with the OntoFair workshop like an hour or two 2 hours ago, and now the FOMI workshop. So I'm glad to see that there is an echo for fair ontologies in this workshop and also in the workshop in Vienna currently happening in parallel of the semantics conference. And I'm super glad that I have the chance to present our work. So thanks, Jan, for inviting me. Thanks, Onto Commons, for looking a little bit at our contributions. Arco Paul has mentioned OFAIR, so I will kind of present the rationale behind it because some of the slides are in common with Arco and me there because they have been produced by EMNA, that is also one of the key actor and author for this work. So I'm focusing here a little bit on not that much on the AgroPortal on semantic resource repository that is kind of similar to the industry portal that was mentioned by Arco, but I'm going to also insist on some of the aspects that Jan has presented and Maria has presented. You'll see that all of that is really connected. So overall, the philosophy was the same than Jans and Maria presented. I will go very fast on some of the presentation because of some of the presentation that have been done before me. So the idea was, how can we measure that? My vision is that ontology repositories help to make ontology fair. So a little difference between Poops and I and our work here is that we wanted to kind of leverage the fact that we can put an ontology in a repository, and we develop ontology repositories in my lab in Montpellier, and so I wanted to kind of evaluate the level to which an ontology repository will help you and makes ontology fairness evaluation possible. So, I mean, we all know about that, the FAIR principle. The key idea was that we need a way to go from those generic principles to different kind of projection to those principles to the semantic artifact or semantic resources object. So I'm not going to get into the fairness assessment approach and the fair metrics. You've seen that slide also in Arco's presentation. Overall, the idea was we need to design a methodology, and that methodology can be possibly implemented in AgroPortal to automatically assess the level of fairness of a semantic resource. And we put ourselves in semantic resource. We include our semantic artifact. We include ontologies, vocabularies, terminologies, thesauri, things that can be put on AgroPortal. So we wanted to start from the ontology. I will describe how we have used that common model called MOD because the metadata aspect is crucial, as mentioned by Arco, Jan, and also Maria right before me. And once we have that metadata, we needed a place where metadata will be curated, harmonized. AgroPortal provides such a place. And so we were able to kind of take the UI that we have in AgroPortal, rely on the metadata description that AgroPortal will provide for ontologies, and then put that little new UI, new vision showing the fairness level of an ontologies there. There is a state of the art in fairness assessment. The key idea is to make a distinction between the approaches that are relevant, that are open to any kind of object, data set in general, from the approach that are specific to semantic resources. And as Maria said, FAIR is a new way of seeing things, but in the semantic web area, there have been discussion on that. So Maria mentioned the 5-star. We also identified the work we've been doing in MOD that was already done 5 years ago with the vision of making a semantic artifact fair, but also the MIRO guidelines, for example, that were published also in the semantic web community as minimum information when you publish or report an ontology, what kind of information you should put in there. And we were not far away from FAIR also with these guidelines. So those are the publications that we have been inspired when we're writing out our methodology, and I explicitly mentioned them in order to also kind of show that the methodologies that were proposed by FAIR is fair, but also the reflections that were happening also in Maria's group were kind of also introduced a little bit in our methodology. So we took those 4 specific methodology or specific to ontologies. We took 2 generic of them. So for those who follow the RDA Research Data Alliance working groups, SHARC and FDMM are 2 working groups that have been working on evaluating, on helping people to evaluate the level of fairness for any kind of data sets or digital object in general. not specifically ontologies. And the green one are the ones that are more specific to ontologies and vocabularies. So our first requirement, I will kind of pass on all of the UI and presentation that Arco has presented for OFAIR. I will focus on our requirements in this study, in this approach, and you'll see the connection. So the first requirement was really, we need a fairness assessment grid. So we need a way to quantify the fact that that something is fair. And we end up asking this question with the group here in discussion also with Jan and others. Is it, how can we evaluate that something is fair, or even more fair than fair, fairer, or just not fair? And so we took the 5 approach that I mentioned that you find here in the on the 2 top right corner diagrams that shows all the different, each principles were more precisely described by each of the approach. So for example, Shark and FDMM will advertise a lot the F1 principle, but you see that FDMM doesn't give a lot of that much importance to F2 or F3 in comparison to A1, for example. And we also did the same with the 4 approaches that were specific to ontologies and semantic artifact in general. And so we kind of also here show the balance. And even if some of the things were pre-existing the FAIR principle, like 5 stars and Miro, you see that they are ignoring some of the aspects in the FAIR principle. For example, all of the accessibility aspects were not mentioned at all in Miro. All of the, for example, the license in R 1.1 was already present in Miro, but not in the 5 star, I think. So we put that, we integrated all of that into some kind of a unique grid that give us from our baseline, like that will give us credits that we will be able to dispatch on questions. And OFAIR really works based on that methodology, on that grid, but any other methods could actually reuse the same grid. Basically, this is a grid that we argue is relevant for semantic artifact based on what the community has provided, what the reflections were of the community when talking about fairness. So we end up with 478 credits that we are able to dispatch on the 15 principles. And we're going to use those 478 credits, for example, so 41 for the F1 principle, and we will dispatch them on specific questions methodology. So that methodology, that metrics help us to evaluate that level of fairness and decide at some point if there is an ontology can be considered as fair or even more fair than fair or not fair. We went a little step further than Fuchs on this. And Maria said we wanted to dig that much, but we took the risk of saying, look, we identified that there is a first threshold that is explained in the paper at around 240 credits. Then you really started getting into fair. And because it's a continuum, you can also get into more fair. Anyway, the requirement number 2 was really a projection of the FAIR principle for the semantic resources. And here, the work that was presented before was super helpful for us. So we end up in 61 questions that are really close to the ones that Maria's presented in the presentation before. And those 61 questions really were the projection of each of the 15 principles for semantic resources or ontologies. And 45 of them of these questions are specific to the semantic resource. And believe it or not, but 16 are independent of the ontology. So when you start talking about the accessibility protocols and the things like that, then you can assess the points based on the fact that the semantic resource is on an ontology repository, and you don't. And so the simple fact of putting the ontology on the repository helps you answer some of the criteria. So we will decide the numbers of points that will go with each questions based on the grid that was provided before. So for example, we will have 10, we will give 10 points, for example, to the question, is the ontology registered in multiple ontology repositories? Exactly the same aspect that Maria's presented a few slides before. But we will also get into specific, more specific aspect also in our 62 questions. So we end up publishing these on GitHub, and the methodology basically make the sum of the score, the sum of the question score, end up with a principal score that is summed up and normalized to end up with what we call a fair score. Our third requirement was really a way to describe the metadata of the semantic artifacts. And for this work was presented. We use MOD 1.4, which is a specification on which we've been working for about 5 years, trying to list the set of properties that could coming from semantic web vocabularies that could be relevant to describe a semantic artifact. And in MOD 1.4, we identified 346 properties like that and used 127 to put them in a model. It was something that say, oh, you want to describe the license? We find 6 properties for a license. One of them is recommended by MOD 1.4, and MOD can be implemented. And that's exactly what we've done in AgroPortal. That's why it's going to help us with the implementation of OFAIR later. And so that was our requirement number 3, really being able to describe the metadata using a standard. And because of that, we've based almost all of the OFAIR methodologies on the resource metadata. So 80% of the questions can be directly asked by looking at the metadata. So for example, answering the questions is the question that I mentioned about the repositories, or that Maria's mentioned about the repositories or registries. We will look at the metadata. We're not going to check online if it's on bioportal or AgroPortal or on Ontology lookup service or industry portal. We're going to rely on one metadata field called schema, including data catalog, that will give us the information if the ontology is in there or not. And we will apply the same rules for a bunch of properties and evaluate the level of fairness on this. So our last requirement was then to find a place where we will have an harmonized and curated environment for ontology descriptions, where those metadata will be curated and harmonized. And AgroPortal exactly did this job in 2017-18. We worked on implementing an MOD inside AgroPortal, and we demonstrate that the role of an ontology repository in harmonizing and the power that you could get by harmonizing the unified metadata in an ontology repository. And so that was our really first work before evaluating the level of fairness. That implementation in AgroPortal was the enabler for this work. So we end up with that tool called OFAIR that was mentioned by Arco, which is a methodology which will, as much as possible, use the metadata values and to answer the series of questions that are really specialized, projected for semantic resources. And we have implemented most of this methodology, but not everything, in a web service that is running outside of AgroPortal or BioPortal. And because it's a web service that runs outside, it can be called by different ontology repositories, including AgroPortal or Industry Portal that was presented before, because we've been collaborating with Arco's group in order to be sure they have the same metadata model in their ontology repositories. And when I say it's not completely implemented, it corresponds to the UI that you see here. The green will tells you the numbers of the score you obtain for a certain principle. The yellow is the score that you did not obtain, so what you have to progress on. And the gray is not the fault. It's not your fault. It's our fault. It's the implementation we haven't been able to take care of yet. So the maximum in gray are the points that a number that an ontology cannot yet reach in AgroPortal because OFAIR hasn't been fully implemented yet. So a good aspect of AgroPortal is that, and OFAIR, is that it helps you evaluate the level of fairness of a given ontology, you'll see in the next slide, but also a group of ontologies. And what you have in front of you here is the UI that is presented on the welcome page of AgroPortal that presents you the total level of fairness, or the average level of fairness for all the ontologies in AgroPortal. So every day we can see how our community is also evolving with respect to fairness. And you see also some of the scores that are really strong around accessibility, for example. They are strong because AgroPortal doesn't help the ontologies to fulfill the requirements there in terms of, for example, what is the protocol that is being used? Is that protocol open and shareably accessible to everyone? And yes, HTTP, for example, that is used by AgroPortal, help us to help any ontologies in the portal answer this aspect. So we have different UIs in AgroPortal that have been implemented and demonstrated partially by Arco previously. But the key one is really that one that was presented that shows you for a given ontology the score, normalize also, and how you manage, and with the explanation that goes with this score. So I insist a little bit on that, is that For each of the 61 questions, we every time possible, we explain if that question is assigned by a metadata field or not, if it's the ontology repository, or if it's linked to a metadata, or if it hasn't been implemented yet. But in the case, for example, of F1Q1, does the ontology have a local identifier? Then we'll be able to assess and give 9 points to that question based on the fact that a URI is present, a URI is valid, and even more, a URI is present and valid. And we have another question that even check if it's resolvable. So we will give also the numbers of points based on the level of fulfillness of a question. And we also inform which ontology property was used to the user. And an interesting aspect of OFAIR is that we can deal with groups of ontologies. So in this UI, I'm using the animal trait ontology, the animal health ontology, and the environment ontology for livestock. Those three ontologies are developed by a shared community, similar groups, and they could be interested in looking at the groups of the ontologies and see how those they can evaluate the level of fairness for this subgroup of ontologies. Of course, this is a web service. So as I mentioned, this runs out of the box that will evaluate the level of fairness based on the metadata that, for example, BioPortal, Industry Portal, or AgroPortal will use. But then it returns you a JSON that you can embed and then develop UI in any places. For example, you can query OFAIR on, for example, the agronomy ontology in BioPortal by just changing a parameter in this line. But if you do that, you will end up with a score that is super low compared to the score we have in AgroPortal, because agronomy ontology in BioPortal doesn't have the metadata fields that I'm arguing on. So OFAIR in summary, just wrapping up my talk on this, the Ontology Fairness Evaluator. This is a web service currently in this version 2, and we are still working on improving the service and some of the implementation of it. Also based on the work that we are doing on ontology metadata. 61 questions, as I said. We have a methodology for behind that is kind of independent of this implementation. Score for an ontology or group of ontologies. Everything is also, of course, open source and available on GitHub, so someone can take. It's a Tomcat. It's a servlet application that runs on Tomcat, so everyone can run its own service locally. And then if someone provides an API to get metadata for the ontologies, then OFAIR can be run. It is currently deployed on AgroPortal, on the industry portal that was mentioned, and also on another portal that we are running in my group called the CIFRE Bioportal, where we handle with terminologies and ontologies, but in French language. And I'm glad also to say that the paper is accepted for publication. A huge 30-page, 2-column paper is accepted, describing all of the questions, all of the aspects that we have been working on. Is accepted for publication in a journal and will be published soon, and it's already available online in our web archive. Well, in conclusion, just wanted to say that we build an approach that has built from other contribution in the FAIR ecosystem, because we've seen that there are a lot of things that is being done around FAIR, including for FAIR ontologies. And we have implemented that generic methodology with a reference evaluation grid. So that grid can be used to implement other tools. OFAIR is one of them, but we can add a question to OFAIR or remove a question if we don't want to evaluate these or these aspects because someone or some group will think that it's not appropriate, without changing the overall methodology and without changing the grid. Overall, the web service implements 51 of the 61 questions, and the key missions that we have behind that is to ease the identification and selection of ontologies to use. I've been working on this subject of ontology selection and recommendation for years. Fairness, FAIR is now a new prism, a new action, new ways of doing this kind of thing. So if the work that we are doing to select or evaluate the level of FAIR ontologies make the ontology more fair, then this mission accomplished, I want to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Clément, for this presentation. Any question to Clément? If not, then I propose I move to the last presentation. So, Clément, if you don't mind, stop sharing. so I can share my screen.
Yeah. No.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Okay. So, well, that would be the last presentation for this session. So we had the automated evaluation from Maria and Clément, and again, thank you, Maria and Clément, for this presentation. Now, one of the things that actually seems to be a core problem is the harmonization of ontology metadata, right? I mean, OFAIR uses MOD. I mean, the FOOPS uses another schema for metadata, although I'm pretty sure they overlap. At some point, this is one of the key things in the FAIR principles, right? That data, in here we talk about ontologies as data, are described with rich metadata, with ontologies and vocabularies that also are fair, and they should be richly described with a priority of accurate and relevant attributes for the data, right? And these are the guiding principles that are coming out from the FAIR paper. Now, if you start thinking of metadata, there are, as Clément was mentioning, a spectrum. If you have no metadata descriptor, well, basically you're not fair because you're not compliant with the principles, right? But then what does it mean, richness, right? Richness is everything between 0 and an infinite number of metadata descriptor. And if we want to evaluate fairness, at some point we need to agree on a minimum number of these metadata descriptors, so that actually there is a threshold where we can say, well, this is fair. Below that, not fair at all. Above that, fair, as was mentioning Clément. Now, we have been working with Clément for the past 4 years on this and discussing about this idea of minimum metadata, the spectrum of fairness, how we do the assessment. And Clément and Biswana have been working on a vocabulary or an ontology to describe ontologies, right? That's called MOD that Clément introduced. So I'm not going to actually talk about it much more. But what the power of this is that MOD is not something new. It's built on on vocabularies that exists, and it provides actually mappings between these different models and how to aggregate them and to enrich them. But then we end up with 127 fields to fill in, which is definitively too much for an ontology to fill, for an ontologist to fill. So we, of course, consider MOD as one of the key elements for defining such minimum metadata, especially for the ontology itself. And in the process, we realized that yes, these ontologies should be published in a repository. So we should consider as well publishing them as collection, and then use a model that actually describes also the collection. So what we worked on for the past 3 years is to actually aggregate DCAT, which is a W3C standard for describing catalogs of data, with the MOD so that we can make a profile of DCAT, which is specific for what we call semantic artifacts, meaning, again, ontologies, thesaurus, vocabularies, whatever, things that contain semantics with a lot of semantic entailment or not. So we started working on the second version, an improved version of MOD, which is MOD2. And this is still work in progress. That was done in the context of RDA and FAIR is fair. And what we did is we worked for several months on trying to aggregate them. And at the end of the process, we actually convened a workshop, organized a workshop all together that actually invited as many ontologists as possible from as many communities as possible. And we ended up with 76 participants from 17 different communities. The idea was to present the MOD2 ID, which is the integration between MOD and DCAT, and start discussing and voting on what would be the most important metadata property for the ontologies and their catalogs. And we ended up at the end of this workshop with a huge list of votes that we analyzed, and from that we created an initial DCAT profile enriched with 12 properties from MOD to describe the semantic artifact. And actually you can find this profile formalized as OWL and shackle constraints on GitHub. It's freely available and you can use it for yourself, because the purpose was to say, well, if we create that schema, it must be in a machine actionable format, not just readable, but you need to be able to do things with it. One of the things we tried to do in the Ferry Sphere context is actually try to use it, right? And so we worked together with another project that's called EOS Pilar, who's building a technology that's called the Federated Fair Data Space, based on the paper I wrote in 2017. And we started working on aggregating 3 ontology portals using that semantic artifact profile. So the Federated Fair Data Space technology, I'm going to show a small diagram as my last slide, but the idea is that you register repositories, provide metadata about the repositories, then you describe their API using the Open API and Smart API approach, so that you generalize and you describe in a machine actionable format the API, and then automatically you can, this API description is used to actually fetch the metadata content, and that metadata content is then used to actually allow you to do the mapping between the metadata you fetched from the API with the DCAT model. And the idea is, once you have defined that mapping, you can actually publish that into what is called a fair data point, which is proposed by GoFair, actually. It's a set of specifications you can find online. And we had the service that was a reference implementation that was developed in FairSphere. And basically, it's a DCAT store with shackle validation and some other features to visualize the data set you imported. So we use that technology, and we try to aggregate this repository, and we actually managed to do that. And they're all aligned on the same metadata schema, both for the collections and for the semantic artifact descriptions. So you can go on the GitHub link here. You should have access to the Sparkle endpoint. If not, then it's just because we forgot to add the link, but we'll provide the link because it's a finished work. And this is just a summary of the what we call FairCat in FairSphere, which is the Federated Fair Data Space from EOS Pilar, improved and specialized for the ontologies, where basically, as I was saying, there is a system that allows you to create mappings, to store them, to create the smart API description of the APIs. And once you have that, then automatically it's converted and published on the fair data points through the server. And on top of that, you have clients that help you doing things without having to program. So basically, it's a way to create a fair catalog with no code, with whatever resources you have that have a REST API. Now, this is my concluding slide. And if we want, so we have now FOOPS, we have OFAIR, there is this FairSphere methodology. At some point, if we want to converge, not necessarily on the tools, because tools can be free, but at least trying to align and converge on one unique methodology for assessment of fairness. Well, this minimum metadata is actually a central key, right? We need to agree on that schema. We need to align them so that, in fact, FOOPS and OFAIR would give you the same results on the metadata, which would make sense. So we have this minimum metadata model, which is just the first version. It's released, so it's open for comments on the communities. And if you have disagreements, or if you think we need to enrich, please do not hesitate to make comments on the GitHub. And we are going to take this version 1 and work on a version 2 in the upcoming months within the context of the Fair Impact project, which is a sort of follow-up project of FairSphere, in which we are together with Clément and Maria, where the idea is that we are going to create a second version, which will be more final, with the agreements from the communities of ontologists, also integrated with the latest version of DCAT, because now we did the work with DCAT 2, but now there's DCAT 3. And the idea would be to integrate this schema in the current evaluation tools so that they can actually at least get this harmonization done, which also explains also the rationale for making it machine actionable. And it is already hard to grasp the concept of fairness, but then if you have too many tools, at some point you don't know as a user which one to choose, which one is the best for your needs, which one gives you the best results. So you may pick and choose based on the amount, the data you or the score you will get, which is not necessarily the best way to go. So it's important also that we work on this harmonization, and this is also going to be in the Fair Impact project. And then one thing that is going to be also on the pipeline is that, well, if you need this metadata, you need alignments with existing metadata. Therefore, this alignment needs what we call mappings, which is sort of a link between the two entities, metadata fields, for instance, into metadata schemas or ontologies between concepts. And so that's also work that I would suggest to follow up, is the work we're going to do in Fair Impact together with Clément and also Maya on the mappings and the models of the mapping, so that we can have fair mappings as requested by the Fair Semantics recommendations. Now, my last slide is just to thank you all for your participation. Thanks to the speaker. Thank you, Arco. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Clément, for joining in that session. It's time for questions. If you don't have questions now, I left my email address on the slide, so you can actually, well, drop a line, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Sorry, stop sharing. So now it's time for questions. We have like 5-10 minutes. Is there any questions, comments from the participants? Arco, is there anyone in the room actually who would like to ask questions or even make a comment on this? I mean, we'll be happy to hear what you have to say as well.
Hi, Jan. I'm not Arco, of course. Arco's not here. So, okay. And I guess there are no questions from the audience. So, oh, hi, Arco.
Yes. So, if there is any question from the audience
or a comment, I mean, something that
I mean, anything you want to discuss openly about FAIR or any concern or question, yeah, please. Yes. Will you come down? Yeah, I mean, it will be better if you can come down. I'll also open the camera so that.
Sure.
So here?
Yes, come down.
Okay. Oh, I don't have to see.
No, okay.
Okay, so hello. My question is about the first F, findable.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, something findable is that you type a keyword on the search engine, and you can reach the right of possible results. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if I did something wrong, but most of the time I noticed that search engine on Ontology
repository doesn't perform so good. So there is, because we push people to use existing ontologies, but it's really difficult to find them, even if we have a list of repositories there to perform a search or something like that. It's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the time I'm downloading, open Notepad, and doing a search within a local repository of files, but it's not that easy, I think.
I totally agree with you. Most of the time, the reason for that is because we're missing metadata on the ontology itself. We have this issue, for instance, in BioPortal. Not all the ontologies are documented. So, for instance, if you would like to make a search by domain of covered by the ontology, you can't have that information. You can't find it. So the approach that we took for the minimum metadata was to actually think about that use case. Is what is the kind of information I would need to retrieve an ontology, right? And that was the question that actually drove the first use case, the first workshop I introduced in my last slide on minimum metadata. And what we are going to try out is to actually define with as many people as possible what would be the different questions that you would like to ask to a search engine on ontology. Well, basically, we are going to follow the process of building an ontology. We need competency questions. And that's the thing. So we need to know what kind of information must be there so that we make sure it is there, right? Now, of course, we do not have any means to force someone who actually created an ontology to fill in this metadata. And we clearly do not have the resources to curate them all. So that is going to be an issue as long as this is not something that is going to be integrated and used by the community of ontologists, meaning documents, and provide as much information as possible. I don't know if my colleagues wants to add something or have another perspective on that.
Maybe I'm just going back to the question, although I totally agree on what you said at the end and the generalization, Jan. To reply the technical question of going on a search engine online and then look it up an ontology. So we made we have a question on that in OFAIR, like a technical question that says how well an ontology is found on search engine, and we find out that the fact of being deposited on AgroPortal, for example, makes it like hugely more findable through the search engine, because we are pretty well indexed by BioPortal or AgroPortal, and in a few months, if the job is well done on Industry Portal, it will be pretty well indexed. Because the search engine deals well with that. Does it basically mean that if you type the ontology title on Google, you'll find it directly on AgroPortal or BioPortal, and in the future, I'm pretty sure in Industry Portal? The problem is that you only answer a certain use case here, which is I have the ontology name and I want to look it up online, and that's not exactly the scenario that most of the people actually are in. They want to type keywords, they want to identify domain, they want to identify competency question, as Jan just said, and say, look, we have those questions. What's the ontology that's going to help me for that? And so there have been 10 or 20, 15 years of literature on what we call ontology and selection and recommendation. And fairness assessment is one step behind that general topic of what is the best way of selecting, trying the Mr. Right or Mrs. Right ontology, as one paper used to be published a few years saying that in this title, how to find Mrs. Right ontology. And you'll see that eventually you end up behind what Google and Bing can provide, and you reach out through an ontology repository. And our job on our side is to make sure that once you reach out the most appropriate ontology repository for your community, is to help you inside this community ontology repository find out the best ontology to use, using a recommender service, using fairness assessment, using specified UI, using search the content and things like that. And we try to support as much as we can those scenarios.
I mean, the question then I would be a little bit how to say, I got the word in French, not in English. Anyway, how easy is it to find an ontology on Google? That's the way. I mean, even Google didn't solve the issue. It solves the issue now because we are relying on things like AgroPortal that are documented ontologies. And so if Google didn't solve the problem, we have to tackle it ourselves. But yeah, it's going to be a process for findability, but the same for interoperability. There are a lot of discussions that needs to happen within the community of the semantic web and ontologies, right? On just do things and do things in a, I would say, in a common, with common best practices. That's also what we try to do with the fair semantics recommendation, to start saying, if we all work together applying some of these very simple principles, then we can easily work with what has been generated in the ontologies, which is not the case as of now, right? And I have been in several use cases where you need to aggregate and find ontologies from different domains. It's just a nightmare. You spend more time trying to find out the right ontology, to integrate them. They are not compatible. There are different levels of representations and so on and so forth, which makes it very hard to work with. And well, the idea is that the tooling is going to help us in some ways, and then discipline or common consensus on the way to build an ontology is going to be the other way, I think. I hope we answered your question. Yes,
yes, I was just first trying to ask that, is there any other question or any other discussion you want to make? But I mean, I wanted to make a comment here. I mean, of course, this finding the ontology, the right ontology, what Clément mentioned, and of course, fair. I mean, the goal of fair is, of course, we need to something. I mean, it is something we need to take care of. However, the current state of metadata, and now, of course, however, I am excited about FAIR is, I mean, I have this little bit concern in my mind that the metadata right now do not accommodate the quality of the ontology as from its content. I mean, for example, like, I mean, Maria has this tool called Oops, which is, of course, exactly about the content. I mean, however, the metadata, of course, is extremely important to make it available in the search engine, to find it in a repository. But also there is a problem there that it also promotes somebody to make a bad ontology with a good packaging. So, of course, it is almost like creating some product and putting it nice, glossy packaging on top of it. With, I mean, it can score excellent in the FAIR, in terms of FAIR. However, the content inside may be extremely bad. So it is not a criticism to the FAIR itself. I mean, of course, FAIR needs to take into account the content of the ontology to make it to see how much useful or you know, I mean, quality-wise.
If I may react to that, Arco, that's not the purpose of FAIR. FAIR doesn't deal with quality. It's a sort of way of packaging the data so that, well, you can work with the item. The only way to assess the quality is going to be you, right? So you will look at the ontology and say, well, that's not workable. Now, I agree that in the metadata content that could be added, so some mention of quality. But what is low quality for you may be, well, okay for me. So this is a subjective also statement. So I know that there is a EOSC task force that works on fair metrics and quality for data, because the same problem goes with data, right? You may have really noisy data, unclean but fair. But as long as they are fair, you can automate, for instance, you can create clients that would be able to get the data and to evaluate the quality based on several other, I would say, criteria, right, for quality, specific to quality. But the aim of FAIR is not actually to take care of quality. And I think that's often the confusion. The same goes for open. FAIR is not open. FAIR is fair.
Yes.
So it means this is the guidelines for data management that you need to follow so that it's much more easier to actually work with your data. That's what it is.
One caveat, I'm sorry, that, okay, of course, for the data, when you talk about the data, of course, I mean, as you said, that it is extremely subjective in a sense, but maybe my concern was more only from the ontology perspective, because there is, I mean, there are many actually ways to really judge that what is a good ontology and bad ontology. And then, in fact, some are wrong ontology. It's not only bad, like, yeah, yes.
Sorry.
Yes, of course. Yes, please.
How can you judge or give score on the quality of the ontology?
Okay. So, of course, as I said, like a bit, there are some, of course, wrong ontology in a sense. Like I'll say, oops, like, I mean, there's a tool from Maria, and then she can talk about that. I'm not trying to describe oops, but then it will really tell you, like, I mean, if there is something wrong in terms of like best practices in the ontology, I mean, and regarding the logic and the pattern. And then, but then apart from oops, which is more on the ontology best practices, there are several matrices in for the ontology, I mean, which is proposed by many people, Figuera, and then also I'm forgetting the name, but then yeah, there is, say, for example, the fitness. I mean, there are completeness, then a clarity.
One of them is
Yeah. There are many literature, but also there are online tools. Yes, which does. Yes, please. Anybody? Yeah.
I wanted to make a comment on that, on the quality of technology, and I think that, I mean, I understand Jan's point of view, but I think that we can use there as some way to also evaluate the quality of the ontology, but as part of different sets of ways to assess the ontology. For example, you can assess it with hooks, if nice with design, then you can use fair, because you can also assess whether the ontology can be accessed, because I think it's a very important point.
Yeah.
And then you can use the metrics you said earlier, for example, using Tom, and I think it gives a good evaluation of the ontology, because you can see from different points of view how good is your ontology, but not just saying, okay, from the design point of view, it's good, and that's it. I mean, you can have different points of view.
I mean, I don't know, Ian, and then other participant. Is it? I mean, you can hear to the comments.
Not really. If you can repeat briefly the questions and the remarks, Arco, please.
It's not a question, but then if you come down, yeah. So one of the audience is making some comments. Yes.
Hi. Well, I just had a quick comment regarding the how to assess the quality of an ontology, and I think that as far as I agree with your point of view, Jan, I think that FAIR can be also used as a way to assess the quality of the ontology, because you can use you can assess this quality from different points of view. You can use, for example, OOPS, assess the quality in design, but you can also take into account if it complies with their principles, just to say, okay, from design, my ontology is well designed. From the design point of view, it's also well designed. And you can also use the metrics that Arco mentioned, for example, with the tool called Tom, and then you can have a wide landscape on how your ontology is of quality or not. So just what does that comment?
Thanks for the comment. Yes, indeed. I mean, being fair is somehow one way of it's a degree of quality, right? It means already your ontology is documented, which is a sort of way of saying this is a quality product, right? Because usually it's not. And the same goes if you look at the metadata structure for concepts and things like that. It is also checked with proofs. I saw Maria raise the hand, so maybe I'll leave the floor for Maria. But thanks for making this point.
Thanks, Jan.
Maria.
I just want to disagree.
Go.
Yeah, so for me, so I know this is being recorded, but I have to say it. I'm very skeptical about considering the frameworks of metrics about as measure of quality, because if an ontology is broader or deeper or has more properties or more classes, and so what? So it is my ontology better because it is deeper? No. So to be honest, I don't use those metrics. But somehow we have to put some metrics, and I think that that approach is fine, or it is very good in something like fairness. So we can measure that you provide the metadata, and we are checking labels, but we are not checking the content. So we can use all the MOD tags and then write rubbish in the content. So we have our checks there. So, and also, for me, it is very clear. My ontology is good, and if the mean, what it is written in the ontology makes sense, right now can only be validated by a human or or other resource that is already validated by a human. So at the end, it's the same. And the ontology is good if the content is good, if the action are well written, if the subclasses make sense. And we cannot check that automatically. And it was very difficult to come up with patterns in OOPS to check the content, but still, it's not perfect. Another thing that I can check that can make my ontology good is good for my purpose, for my application, whether I can annotate all my data. Maybe the action is still wrong, but I can annotate the data. So from my point of view, I think that having a lot of high ranking in FAIR is making your ontology nicer to the potential user. If you want to be nice because you want to be adopted, but my ontology could be perfect and can have the perfect actions. If I don't want to share them, it's still a good ontology, but I use within my organization. And that's me breaking the conversation.
No. But I totally agree with you, Maria. And also, I mean, what is good for me now may not be good for someone else. I mean, as ontologist, I do remember discussions on definitions of concepts, and you end up having people disagreeing on the word experiments, which is crazy. They're all scientists. They should all agree on the concept. They all have different views. So in a sense, defining the quality of an ontology, there are markers, but I agree when it relates to content, the way the model has been designed, the way the hierarchy has been constructed, this is use case dependent. And we need to keep in mind that as humans, we all have our own ontology in the head. That's the one we put on paper, and it's all different. And part of the work that we are doing on an everyday basis, and actually that's what the things we're doing here, is to transfer information from human to human to make sure we agree on the same ontology. That's what we do every day when we discuss and we agree on things. And so this is where I agree with Maria. It's getting tricky to assess quality of the content. Fairness, and thanks for the comment, is indeed one kind of a quality. If it's documented, if it's well documented, it can be adopted, can be reused. You may disagree on the model, but for instance, reuse some of the concepts of that ontology, right? You can reuse parts of things to create your own. So as long as this is, I mean, this is your choice. So you're going to define the quality. Maybe, and I think that's where FAIR is also helpful, that information can be then added to the metadata. So when you share it again, it's enriched with comments from users that says, well, the logic is a bit shaky on that part, things like that, so that when you get the ontology, you get this information as well. But yeah, but this, I do remember a workshop organized a long time ago where Robert Stevens from UK actually was doing he was playing the devil's advocate. Why don't we use software engineering methods for tracking quality of ontologies as we do with software? This is exactly the same issue. How do we track quality? Why don't we use, because an ontology is a kind of a software, so can we be inspired by some of things? And I think that question remains unanswered. So we still have work to go.
I try to convince, or when I review papers, I try to ask for that, or I tell my students that because one of the typical methods is, okay, I run a reasoner and I detect no inconsistencies. That is like, okay, if you only have the ontology and you don't have data annotated, you can find less inconsistencies that if you are actually using the ontology. And that is really related with your comment about the software engineering, because in software you check like the values out of range and the layout and values in the middle. So do the same with ontologies. Annotate data that is supposed to not be valid according to your model and see whether you can find the inconsistency or not. But there are people just say, okay, I run a reasoner and there were no errors. Yeah, maybe your ontology doesn't even have enough axioms to generate errors.
Yes. And also it's data dependent, right? We tend to forget that ontology is used as a classifier. So the only way to test is to make sure that the data is in the right category when you run the reasoner, so that the data is in the right place. So, but indeed, that's a methodology that is not documented or it's patchy. And so maybe that's something that as a community or as ontologists, we need to think through, and at some point maybe have some ontology test suite that goes along the lines of, oops, you already started the way, Maria, and adding up more stuff that would be more in the line of this software engineering approach.
Okay, I have to just mention that we are almost approaching lunch, and then and to all you online participants, I have to say sorry. You cannot enjoy our lunch, but then yes, thank you so much for participation, and then thank you, Ian, for organizing this specially,
Sure.
And then Maria and Clément for the speech.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for the comments and the participation. Yes. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy lunch.
Thanks.